required. It's for members of the Human Society who want to get some talk about next year's conference. Not only that, but also how we can mention and all the other things of the activities together. But it's society business. So students, you are not required. You can go for a long lunch, and anyone else who wants to come in who isn't a member should become a member. But it's society business. So that's 1 p.m. at the other room, the room where we got your badges from. Okay. And then we start the next panel will be at 2 p.m. So we have 1 hour for the AGM, and then everyone comes back to this room at 2 p.m. Okay? Good? Okay.
That's fine.
Okay, I'll pass it on to that.
All right, hi everyone. This is our next panel, and our first speaker is Charlie Armstrong, who is professor in the Department of Foreign Languages and Translation at the University of Malta. He's the author of Reframing Yeats, Genre, Illusion, and History, and of course several other works as well. He is the current president of the International Yeats Society and one of 3 co-editors of the Edinburgh Companion to W. Yeats and the Arts. Today his paper is titled Conjuring a Theatre, Yeats, the Abbey, and the Norwegian Concern.
Thanks very much, Begini. Is this a microphone? I was given this. Does it work?
That's for the transmission.
This is for the transmission. So I hold this or move this. Do I?
Yeah, that's it.
Is this good? You hear me? Testing, testing. That's all right? Yeah, great. Yeah. I remember it's 17 years ago now. It's terrible how time passes. 17 years ago, I was going to be a guest scholar in Galway, and wonderful place, Galway, very friendly people. And Louis de Power, is that how you say? He said, "Oh, nice to meet you, Charlie. Yeah, you work on Yeats. Do you work on connections between Norway and Ireland?" And I remember, Norway and Ireland literature? I got really snooty. I was like, no, don't do that. Now, alas, I'm doing it. I've come around to it after 17 years, or at least giving it a shot. Thanks, sorry. So I thought I'd just mention, start from an angle here by referring to everyone's, or some people's favorite book, I'm sure, Umberto Eco's best-selling thriller, The Name of the Rose, which famously speculates about the discovery of the missing part of Aristotle's Poetics. No doubt if we had Aristotle's views on comedy, in addition to tragedy, the history of literary theory would have taken some interesting turns. And many academics will have these kind of counterfactual dreams of discovering lost manuscripts of this sort. If I could choose, at least today, I'd be tempted to go for a more obscure and undoubtedly less important text than Aristotle's Poetics. I think I'd opt for some verses Yeats wrote for Edward Gordon Craig's 1903 production of Henrik Ibsen's The Vikings of Helgeland, which was staged at the Imperial Theatre in London. According to John Kelly's notes on the Intellect site for Yeats's collected letters, the Irishman wrote verses for a funeral chant uttered by the character of Ernulf for his 7 dead sons. Apparently, when they came down to staging the play, it was decided that Yeats's verse seemed un-Ibsenish. So the production ended up using William Archer's original translation instead, apparently without Yeats himself being told or even being aware that they'd swapped out his own text. Yeats's verse appears to be lost, but it would be intriguing to see Yeats ventriloquizing Ibsen. It'd be certainly a singular addition to the wider canon of Yeats's writings, and it'd be interesting to see what Peter MacDonald would make of it in his edition, no doubt, too. Can swap again. I start with his anecdote because the main topic of this talk will be Yeats's underestimated affinity with Ibsen in particular and Norwegian theatre in a broader perspective. Yeats's first biographer, Joseph Hone, claimed that, quote, Yeats was persistently prejudiced against Ibsen, perhaps on account of the insistence of Ibsen's English disciples on the social message, and he overlooked the great poet. As Irene Ruppel Malone has put it, though, and I quote again, Yeats knew his Ibsen, Nonetheless, the image of Yeats as someone who hated Ibsen was passed on to future historians, while Yeats, the Ibsenite proselytizer, is forgotten. In this talk, I'm going to focus on how Yeats presented Ibsen and his countryman Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson and the Norwegian theatre in general as an example during a formative period for the Abbey Theatre around 1900, before concluding my talk with a little coda where I'll speculate a little bit on connections between this episode and Yeats's later theory of the mask, or maybe I should say, after listening to Neil yesterday, I should say the daimon, or the collective daimon, perhaps. Switch again. When Yeats came to Stockholm to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, he started his banquet speech, which is seldom reproduced, on 10th of December 1923, by remarking, "I have been all my working life indebted to the Scandinavian nation." His Swedish audience may have been puzzled by this. What nation was he referring to? The continuation of his speech would not have fully clarified matters. He went on to speak warmly of the Swedish mystic Swedenborg, before admitting that he did not, quote, "think that our Irish theatre could ever come into existence but for the theatre of Ibsen and Bjørnson." So he's kind of riffing off Sweden and Norway together here. And perhaps there's a kind of hope one day they'll be together in a Scandinavian nation. I don't know. Yeats was effectively referring to Ibsen and Bjørnson here, reminiscing about the birth of the Abbey Theatre, something that was in his mind in Stockholm, as his acceptance speech was, of course, a meditation on the Irish dramatic movement. Ibsen's formal mastery and innovation in the introduction of a realistic idiom for modern drama led him to be a major influence on Abbey playwrights such as Edward Martyn, John Millington Synge, and Teresa Deevy. If, however, we look for the first instance where Norway is explicitly presented as a clear exemplar for the Irish theatre, this is to be found in the 1899 edition of Beltane. How do you pronounce it? Beltane?
Beltane, I think.
Beltane, which was a journal for the National Literary Society in Ireland. There, Yeats writes a piece under the programmatic heading of Plans and Methods, outlining key principles for the new theatre in Ireland. At this point, Yeats is trying to imagine, or we can say conjure up, a new national theatre at a point when he feels this does not exist on his home ground. The opening words of the article look immediately to the north. Norway has a great and successful school of contemporary drama, he writes, which grew out of a national literary movement very similar to that now going on in Ireland. Everywhere, critics and writers who wish for something better than the ordinary play of commerce turn to Norway for an example and an inspiration. In this text, Yeats goes on to state that his goal for the Irish literary theatre is akin to, quote, what has been done in London and in Paris, but that the plays in Ireland will differ from those of London and Paris because times have changed and because the intellect of Ireland is romantic and spiritual rather than scientific and analytical. Yeats thus alludes to preceding initiatives to rebel against actor-led commercial theatres such as André Antoine's Théâtre Libre and the London-based Independent Theatre. While Yeats's colleague and associate, the Anglo-Irish George Moore, embraced such developments without reservations, for Yeats himself, Norway rather becomes a key exemplar in a way that is impossible for France and England, presumably since Norway shares a romantic and spiritual dimension with Ireland. England, of course, is a key context here, since the English theatre is where Yeats and other Irish writers were originally exposed to the work of Ibsen. Norway's status as being romantic and spiritual makes it an exception to the rule of materialism and modernity, an outlier. And by virtue of this, it is comparable to, and indeed provides an example for, Ireland, which in Yeats's view finds itself in the same marginal position with regard to the materialism of the England of his time. The dating of the Beltane article, May 1899, is significant, as the theatrical scene in Norway was approaching a milestone at this point. Although the post-Napoleonic Restoration and the Treaty of Kiel had freed Norway from the yoke of Denmark and given the country its own constitution in 1814, it was to remain under Swedish rule until 1905. During the 19th century, there were early stirrings of Norwegian nationalism in Henrik Wergeland's Kampbellerne, which drew on the example of Scottish writers such as Robert Burns and Sir Walter Scott. In 1850, the internationally celebrated violinist Ole Bull founded what he called the Norske Teater, the Norwegian theatre in Bergen, an institution that insisted upon the use of Norwegian actors and Norwegian language. An early force there was a young, inexperienced playwright called Henrik Ibsen, with only 2 plays to his name, who later was followed by Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson as the director of the theatre in Bergen. During the same period, the Norwegian capital of Oslo, which was called Christiania at this point, also saw the birth of a parallel institution, Christiania Norske Teater, the Norwegian theatre of Christiania, where Ibsen indeed became artistic director in 1857. So these 2 theatres in Bergen and Oslo, they had varying success, but over the next few decades, the Norwegian theatre made major strides, largely thanks to the renown of Ibsen and Bjørnson, not only in Denmark, but also abroad. And on the 1st of September 1899, statues of Ibsen and Bjørnson flanked the brand new building of the new institution. The National Theatre opened in the Norwegian capital. The event was well prepared. The building process had started in 1891, and in 1898, Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson's son was appointed director of the new institution. This process was observed with interest from England, where the London Daily Express presented an article by W.H. Herford titled "The Scandinavian Dramatists." This article was strategically reprinted in the same issue of the Beltane, featuring Yeats's comments, and was fulsome in its praise of the Norwegian theatre. Importantly, Herford downplayed Ibsen's later disillusionment with the Norwegian theatre, which was a key factor behind the mythical topos of exile Ibsen would create around his lengthy residence abroad in Germany and Italy. In a manner that anticipated the Irish interpretation of Ibsen's exile, Herford insisted that, quote, Ibsen grew up in the midst of a great national revival whose currents did not indeed determine his goal in art, but undoubtedly affected the path by which he reached it. Herford insisted upon the classical dimension of Norwegian drama in a way that chimes with Yeats's claim that something better than the ordinary play of commerce was involved. Both writers were pointing towards a theatrical ideal in opposition to the popular, conventional drama of the time. For Yeats, this entailed that the budding Irish dramatists should learn their trade from foreign masters, such as Ibsen, Molière, and Racine, in the same way that visual artists studied foreign masters, such as Poussin or Canova, say. Further, it informed the idea of a drama that was literary in essence, as he would specify in an article on the 6th of May, 1899. He writes, "We have called our experiment the Irish Literary Theatre, although we knew that literary sounded ill in playgoers' ears. And we have issued a circular describing the Norwegian theatre, which hatched that northern phantom, Dr. Ibsen, as the only theatre at once literary and popular." As Michael McAteer has pointed out, and I quote, "Yeats was drawn to Ibsen and his achievement in Norway precisely because it was at once intellectual and popular." The Norwegian example here combined tendencies that otherwise appeared to be mutually exclusive, and which arguably the later no-inspired Yeats largely gave up on reconciling. When Yeats returns to Ibsen's exemplary role in a 1901 edition of Savin, the journal that replaced the Beltane, the literary aspirations of the new Irish theatre is given a further articulation. He writes, "There is no chance of our writers of Gaelic or our writers of English doing good plays of any length if they do not study the masters. If Irish dramatists had studied the romantic plays of Ibsen, the one great master the modern stage has produced, they would not have sent the Irish Literary Theatre imitations of Boucicault, who had no relation to literature. One might note here the confluence between mastery and romanticism, one might note the confluence between mastery and romanticism. The Norwegian critics Narve Fullsås and Tore Rem have pointed out how Peer Gynt, the standout romantic play of Ibsen's, actually played very little role in establishing Ibsen's international reputation. And yet for Yeats, the romantic Ibsen was essential. A 1984 book review had earlier seen him highlighting Ibsen's romantic verse dramas Brand and Peer Gynt for this reason. As previously mentioned, in March 1903, Yeats even went to the lengths of writing a lament for the use of the Craig's production of Ibsen's The Vikings of Helgeland, an even earlier Ibsen play in the romantic mode. Please. Yeats's next significant use of Ibsen takes place in 1904 in an article in The Savin titled First Principles. There he focuses upon a feature of Norwegian drama more associated with Bjørnson than Ibsen. He writes, "In the small nations which have to struggle for their national life, one finds that almost every creator, whether poet or novelist, sets all his stories in his own country. I do not recollect that Bjørnson ever wrote of any land but Norway, and Ibsen, though he lived in exile for many years, driven out by his countrymen, as he believed, carried the little seaboard towns of Norway everywhere in his imagination." Ibsen is thus appropriated to the same paradigm as Bjørnson, made to fall in line, as it were. This might be indicative of Bjørnson's rising stock at this particular point in history. The previous year, he had won the Nobel Prize of Literature, and on the 19th of November 1901, Yeats had attended a production of his play Beyond Human Power. At this high point of Yeats's sensitivity to Bjørnson's work, the Norwegian rootedness of Bjørnson's drama influences Yeats's reading also of Ibsen. What both of these two Norwegian dramatists share, according to Yeats, is a literature rooted in a national landscape. Their example is once again contrasted with the major European countries that Yeats wishes to sideline as key exemplars for Ireland. He goes on to say, "So as far as we can be certain of anything, we may be certain that Ireland, with her long national struggle, her old literature, her unbounded folk imagination, will, insofar as her literature is national at all, be more like Norway than England or France." Yet again, we have the comparative context where the small Scandinavian country is interpreted as presenting an exception to the deracinated modernity of the more dominated European powerhouses. Not only a rootedness in place then, but also a vital nationalism distinguishes Norway and Ireland from France and England, whose internationalism is presented as a desiccated cosmopolitanism. Also later, the example of Ibsen and Norway would arguably play a persistent role for the Abbey, albeit in a less explicit fashion. I previously mentioned Yeats's comments on winning the Nobel Prize in 1923. Adrian Fraser has also interestingly highlighted how Ibsen's depiction of what he calls the righteous intellectual who stands whole and is thought wrong by the liberal majority but proved right in time by progress, that this figure would become an underlying trope, not only for Yeats, but also for George Moore, Edward Martyn, and George Bernard Shaw. One thinks of Yeats, standing up on the stage of Abbey Road, of Abbey Theatre and berating his audience. And this is very much in line with the controversies around Ibsen's plays and his leading characters who stand against the crowd in a way, in a outspoken protest. There's also a fun little anecdote, a little bit on in this history. When Yeats installed a relatively young and inexperienced Lennox Robinson as manager of the Abbey in 1910, he told him, "I am doing what that man did who took Ibsen from behind the counter in a chemist shop and set him to manage the Norwegian theatre. He was no older than you, and like you, was ignorant of the work he was sent to." Lennox Robinson did not become the new Ibsen, but still, it's a fun fun analogy. And it shows that Ibsen was in the back and the Norwegian theatre was still in the back of Yeats's mind when he was developing the Abbey as late as 1910. If Yeats, Gregory, and their colleagues did not feel entirely ignorant of the work they faced at the beginning of the 20th century, it was in part because Ibsen and his countrymen had already blazed a trail for them. What are we then to make of Yeats's use of Ibsen and Norway during this formative stage of the Abbey Theatre? No doubt the contrast with Yeats's more critical remarks about Ibsen's realistic plays suggests some degree of opportunism. Ibsen had a prestige at this point that made him a strategic reference. At the same time, scholars such as Irene Rupo, Tore Rem, and Michael McAteer have revealed that Yeats's plays feature many unacknowledged borrowings, particularly from the plots of Ibsen's realist plays. So one could just as justifiably turn the tables and argue that Yeats's denunciations of Ibsen actually obscure a substantial influence. In this regard, Yeats's belligerent rhetoric fits a larger pattern, which has some parallels with how he treated figures such as Edward Dowden and Matthew Arnold, or say modernism in general. Whether he knows it or not, he seems to be more of the devil's party often in these debates than he tends to acknowledge himself. So, here I want to stress instead that Yeats's use of Ibsen, Bjørnson, and the Norwegian theatre in the years leading up to the establishment of the Abbey Theatre constitutes an interesting example of consciously using an external model. Although the circumstances obviously are unique in some respects, it does have certain parallels in Yeats's career. One might think of the later adoption of the conventions of the Japanese No, which, although more of an individual choice, again sees him turning to an established theatrical tradition from abroad. The emphasis on Ibsen, and to a lesser extent Bjørnson, as having produced masterpieces that can function as examples for Irish playwrights, connects with the neoclassical tenets of sculpture and painting. Although Jack Quinn's recent monograph on Yeats and sculpture reveals Yeats's boredom with copying classical eyes and noses and plaster fruit in his own education as an art student, something of this tendency survives, infused with a Coleridgean emphasis on the artist's use of his own imagination in Yeats's later poetics. In that poetics, it is, of course, the concept of the mask, or indeed the daimon, that most clearly shows Yeats consciously embracing an external model for personal and artistic self-development. Scholars such as George Bornstein have pointed out how the theory of the mask is linked to a romantic philosophy of love, where the beloved functions as a